The air tasted like a storm had just passed, thick with the smell of wet asphalt and ozone. I stood on my back patio, the cement still dark and damp, and watched two people march across my lawn like they owned it. Maybe they thought they did. This sort of thing happens. If you're watching Karenology, you already know it's never just a simple misunderstanding. The woman in the lead was Brenda, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association. She had a haircut you could set your watch by and a posture that screamed she'd been born to complain to the manager. Trailing a step behind her was her pet contractor, Steve, a man who looked like he'd deflate if you poked him with a sharp stick. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, my hands tucked in my pockets, and let them come. My right hand closed around a cool, heavy piece of brass. A pressure gauge from an old life, a reminder. It was a habit I couldn't shake. Brenda stopped a few feet from me, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She was holding a bright orange piece of paper. "Mark," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We've had some concerns." Steve just nodded, his eyes darting to the structure behind me. The building that was the whole reason for this little parade. My workshop, my project, my penance. "This is a notice of violation," Brenda announced, her voice hardening. She stepped past me and slapped the paper against the glass door of the workshop. The sound of the cheap adhesive tape pulling from its roll was loud in the humid air. $2,000 for the unapproved luxury structure. I let out a slow breath. Luxury. If she only knew. From the outside, it was designed to look like a tidy little pool house. Clean lines, a small deck, tinted windows. But inside, there was no bar, no changing rooms. Just concrete, steel, and a whole lot of plumbing. "This isn't a luxury structure, Brenda," I said, my voice flat. "It's a utility building." "The Homeowners Association bylaws are quite clear," she shot back, tapping a manicured finger on the paper. "Any detached structure with plumbing and electricity is classified as an auxiliary dwelling unit, subject to community fees and taxes." Have you ever tried to explain simple physics to a brick wall? A very smug, very blonde brick wall? It felt a lot like that. I'd spent 2 years designing this system. My own money, my own time. It was a high-capacity overflow collector, designed to divert storm runoff and relieve pressure on the neighborhood's ancient drainage system. It was the only thing stopping half our street from flooding every time we got a heavy rain. It was my way of making things right. A silent apology for a mistake I'd made years ago. A miscalculation on a municipal project that cost my best friend Hal his career. He never blamed me, but I did. That old brass gauge in my pocket was from that very project. It was a constant heavy weight. "It's a storm shelter," I tried again. "The county even exempted it." Brenda laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "The county doesn't set our rules, Mark. We do. You built a private water park in your backyard while the rest of us pay for sidewalk repairs." She smoothed the notice down with the palm of her hand, her distorted reflection smiling back at her from the glass. "Pay the fine, or we'll start the process of putting a lien on your property." The word lion hung in the air, heavy and ugly. This wasn't about a fine. This was about power. My building was something she didn't control, and she couldn't stand it. I could feel the old anger, the kind I'd worked so hard to bury, begin to stir. If this is a story that feels a little too familiar, do me a favor and hit that like button. You know how this goes. They turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the orange paper staring me in the face. It was a declaration of war. I looked at Steve's back, at the way he walked with a little more swagger now that he was heading away from me. Just as they reached the edge of my property, Brenda stopped and turned back. Her smile was gone. Her face was cold, hard. "And Mark," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the damp grass. "We'll be watching. Every rule you break, every blade of grass that's too long, we'll find it." She didn't have to watch. She had the whole neighborhood watching for her. A week later, I walked into the community clubhouse for the monthly homeowners association meeting. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and self-importance. I'd brought diagrams, county permits, even a letter from a civil engineer explaining exactly what my building did. I was ready to fight logic with logic. It was a stupid plan. The room was a sea of floral shirts and judgmental stares. Brenda sat at the head of the long table, the queen on her particle board throne. She called the meeting to order, and I waited my turn, my folder of documents feeling heavier with every passing minute. When she finally called my name, a little ripple went through the room. Entertainment had arrived. I stood up and laid out my case, keeping my voice even. I explained the drainage issues, showed them the flood maps from 5 years ago. This structure, I said, tapping the diagram, isn't for me. It's for all of us. It prevents what happened on Elm Street 2 years ago, when basements flooded and foundations were damaged. A few people shifted uncomfortably, they remembered, but Brenda was already shaking her head, a patient little smile on her face, the kind a teacher gives a child who just doesn't get it. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we appreciate your civic-mindedness, but the bylaws are the bylaws." She held up the thick, spiral-bound book of rules like it was a holy text. Page 42, Section C, Paragraph 3. Any detached structure over 100 square feet with permanent plumbing is an auxiliary dwelling unit, no exceptions. "But the county granted an exemption," I protested. "They recognize it as a civil defense asset." "This isn't the county," she snapped, her smile vanishing. "This is our community, and in this community, we all follow the same rules." A murmur of agreement went through her loyal followers. I looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face. I found none. "Your appeal is denied, and for willfully defying the initial notice, the board has voted to double the fine. It is now $4,000. My jaw tightened. This was never about a rule. It was a power play, plain and simple. I gathered my useless papers, the silence in the room pressing in on me. I felt like I was back in that hearing room 20 years ago, my own diagrams proving my own failure. The weight in my pocket felt a little heavier. But the real gut punch came later that night. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from a neighborhood social media group I'd forgotten I was even in. Someone had posted a photo. It was my workshop, taken from an angle that made it look grand and imposing. The caption, written by Brenda, was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive warfare. While so many of us are struggling to keep up with rising costs, it's wonderful to see some neighbors are living in such comfort. A friendly reminder that homeowners association fees are for everyone, not just for the little people. Yes, community first. It was the comments that really did it. A cascade of anger, envy, and righteous indignation. Hundreds of them. Thumbs down emojis, angry red faces. People I'd known for years, people I'd shared a beer with, were tearing me apart. Have you ever seen your reputation get shredded in real time by people you thought were your friends? It's a strange, hollow feeling. Then I saw a comment from Dave, who owned the local diner. The guy I'd helped when his walk-in freezer died. No charge. He'd simply posted a single emoji, a money bag. That one hurt more than all the others combined. I scrolled through the digital mob, the blue light of the phone painting my face in the dark room. A new notification popped up at the top of the screen. Brenda had just added another photo. This time, it was a close-up of my front door with a new, larger fine notice stuck to it. The next morning, the world outside my front door felt different, hostile. When I walked down my driveway to get the mail, my neighbor across the street, a guy I'd been waving to for a decade, suddenly got very interested in his lawn sprinkler. He just turned his back on me. It was like I had a disease. I decided to go to Dave's diner. I needed to look him in the eye. The place was half full, the usual morning crowd. The smell of bacon and coffee was thick in the air. When I walked in, a couple of conversations just stopped. They picked up again a moment later, a little quieter, a little more strained. Dave was behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. He saw me, and for a split second, his face was a mask of guilt. Then it hardened. He nodded once, a curt, businesslike gesture. No smile, no, "Hey, Mark." I sat down at the counter. "Morning, Dave," I said. "Mark," he replied, not looking at me. He moved down the counter, refilling a sugar dispenser. "I saw your comment last night," I said, keeping my voice low. "The money bag, nice touch." He finally stopped and turned to face me. His eyes were cold. "Look, man," he said, his voice a low grumble. "People are talking. Brenda's got everyone wound up. They're saying you're getting special treatment, that you think you're better than everyone else." "You know that's not true, Dave," I said. "You know me." "Do I?" He tossed the rag into a plastic bin. "All I know is my fees went up 10% this year to cover community improvements. And you've got a private clubhouse in your backyard. It doesn't look good, Mark. It just doesn't. He turned and walked into the kitchen without another word. The door swung shut behind him. I sat there for a long moment, the clatter of plates and silverware sounding unnaturally loud. It was a clear message. I wasn't welcome here anymore. I stood up, left a $5 bill on the counter for a coffee I never ordered, and walked out. The little bell on the door chimed, announcing my departure to a room full of people who were glad to see me go. I needed a different strategy. Logic wasn't working. Friendship wasn't working. I needed an ally who wasn't afraid of Brenda. There was only one person who fit that description. George. George was a neighborhood institution. He'd lived in the same house on the corner for 60 years and had served on every community board imaginable before retiring. He'd seen it all. I found him in his garage, meticulously sharpening a set of wood chisels. The air smelled of oil and sawdust. He listened patiently as I laid out the whole story, his shrewd eyes never leaving my face. When I was done, he wiped a chisel with a clean cloth and set it down. Brenda, he said with a sigh, like he was talking about a chronic toothache. She's always been about control. It's not about the money. It's about everyone marching to her drum. He was silent for a moment. Then he looked up at me. You said the problem is storm runoff, but when I moved here, the low point of the street wasn't your end. It was down by the old oak tree, 3 blocks over. I frowned. They rerouted the main drain 10 years ago, when they built that new cul-de-sac. Did they? George's eyes had a sudden glint. Or did they just block it? He walked over to a dusty filing cabinet in the corner of his garage. After a moment of rummaging, he pulled out a thick photo album. He flipped through the crackling plastic pages and pointed to a faded picture. It was a photo from the 80s. A bunch of kids were splashing in a massive puddle that covered the entire intersection down by the old oak tree. Water was lapping at the curbs. This was after every big storm, George said. Every single time. But you know what? Your end of the street, bone dry. It was a lead, a small one, but it was something. It meant the water wasn't naturally flowing toward my property. Something had changed, something man-made. George gave me one last piece of advice. Don't fight Brenda on her turf. Don't argue bylaws. Find out where the water is really going, and why. He tapped the photo. The answer isn't in her rule book, it's in the ground. Following George's advice felt like I was finally on the right track. It wasn't about fighting a fine anymore. It was about solving a puzzle. The first step was to get the official records. I spent the next morning at the county clerk's office, a place that smelled of old paper and quiet desperation. After an hour of navigating a digital archive that seemed to be designed by someone who hated people, I found it. The original drainage plans for our subdivision from 1968. Then I pulled up the plans from the 2010 cul-de-sac expansion. I laid the 2 sets of blueprints side by side on a large table. The old system was simple. A large main drain ran the length of the neighborhood, collecting water and channeling it out toward the creek. The new plans, however, were odd. They showed the old main drain being capped off right before the new development. In its place was a new, smaller pipe that diverted the flow directly toward the lower end of the street. My end. It was inefficient. It was illogical. It was almost intentionally bad engineering, the kind of thing that creates a problem, not solves one. But it was approved, signed off on. The engineer of record? A company I'd never heard of. But the contractor who did the work was a name I knew all too well. S&S Construction, Steve's company. I needed someone inside the system to help me make sense of it. I made a call to the county's water management department. I didn't expect much, but I got lucky. The woman who answered the phone was young, and she sounded bored out of her mind. When I started asking specific questions about hydrology and flow rates, her tone changed. Her name was Aisha. She was a junior inspector, fresh out of college, and it turned out she was more interested in drainage infrastructure than anyone I'd ever met. I explained my situation, and she listened, really listened. That sounds weird, she said after I finished. Capping a primary drain like that would put immense pressure on the secondary lines. It's a flood waiting to happen. It's a flood that's already happening, I told her, but one person is benefiting from it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. I'm looking at the work order from 2010 now, she said slowly. The contracting bids. S&S Construction wasn't the low bidder, not even close. But they got the job. My gut tightened. This was getting deeper. Can you find out who approved that? Another pause. The approval came from the supervisor of planning at the time, a Mr. Henderson. He retired a few months after the project was completed. I had a new piece of the puzzle, but I still couldn't see the whole picture. I thanked Aisha, who promised to do some more digging on her end. She seemed genuinely intrigued, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had someone in my corner. Armed with this new information, I felt a surge of confidence. I had proof of shoddy, overpriced work. I had the original plans. I had an expert from the county who agreed it was wrong. This was it. This was the silver bullet. I requested a special meeting with the Homeowners Association board. This time, I didn't care about the other residents. This was just for the board, just for Brenda. We met in the same sterile clubhouse. I laid the blueprints on the table. I showed them the bid sheets I'd gotten from Aisha. I explained in clear, simple terms how the drainage system had been sabotaged, how Steve's company had been overpaid to do it, and how my workshop was the only thing preventing a major disaster. Brenda listened, her face unreadable. When I finished my presentation, she didn't even glance at the documents. She just looked at me. "This is all very interesting, Mark," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "A fascinating conspiracy theory, but it changes nothing." "Changes nothing?" I was stunned. "This is proof of corruption. Your pet contractor created this problem." "What this is," she said, leaning forward, "is a desperate attempt to deflect from the fact that you broke the rules. You built an unapproved structure, and now you're making wild accusations to avoid paying your fine." She stood up. "The board stands by its decision. The fine is now $5,000 due to continued noncompliance and your disruptive behavior." She turned to leave, but I wasn't done. "You won't get away with this, Brenda." She stopped at the door and looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw a flash of real, venomous anger in her eyes. "Get away with what?" she hissed. "Protecting our community from people like you who think the rules don't apply to them?" Then she delivered the final blow. "And just so you know," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I took the liberty of forwarding your little investigation to S&S Construction. I thought Steve should know he's being slandered." That night, the air felt charged, heavy. A storm was rolling in, the real kind this time, with dark bruised clouds gathering on the horizon. I stood by the window, watching the wind whip the trees into a frenzy. Brenda's threat echoed in my mind. She hadn't just ignored my evidence, she'd weaponized it. She'd sicked Steve on me. I should have been worried, but honestly, I was relieved. The fight was finally out in the open. No more whispers, no more social media posts. Let him come. I knew I was right. I had the county permit that officially designated my workshop as a community storm shelter. It was my trump card, the one piece of paper that overrode all of Brenda's petty bylaws. The next afternoon, I walked to the community center for the final official vote on the lien. The meeting was packed. Brenda had made sure of that. It felt less like a hearing and more like a public execution. My execution. I let Brenda and her cronies make their case. They talked about rules, about fairness, about the sanctity of the Homeowners Association's authority. Then it was my turn. I didn't bring my blueprints this time. I brought one single sheet of paper. I walked to the front of the room and placed the document on the overhead projector for everyone to see. "This," I announced, my voice ringing with confidence, "is a certificate from the County Office of Emergency Management. It designates my structure as an official community shelter. Under county law, it is exempt from local ordinances and taxes that would impede its function." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. People were leaning forward, squinting at the screen. I saw a flicker of panic in Brenda's eyes. She hadn't expected this. I had her. The law was on my side. Then Brenda stood up, a smug smile slowly spreading across her face. "Thank you, Mark. That's a very impressive document." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "But it seems you've misunderstood. The county can declare anything it wants. However, this is private property, governed by a private contract that we all agreed to when we bought our homes. Our bylaws supersede county designations in matters of property use." My blood ran cold. Was she right? I had no idea. "In fact," she continued, pulling a piece of paper from her own folder, "we were so concerned about your unique interpretation of the rules that we asked our attorney for clarification. He agrees. The Homeowners Association's covenants hold precedence here." She held up the letter. It looked official, legal, My one ace had just been trumped. Therefore, she said, her voice booming with triumph, I moved that the board vote to place a lien on Mr. Wright's property for failure to pay accumulated fines and for the immediate removal of the non-compliant structure at his expense. It was a nightmare. Hands shot up all around me, one after another. I looked for a friendly face, a moment of hesitation, anything. And then I saw him. Dave, my friend, the man whose business I'd saved. He looked at me, his face a mixture of fear and apology. And then, slowly, his hand went up. That's when it broke me. The room started to spin. The voices faded into a dull roar. Betrayal is a funny thing. It's not a sharp pain. It's a slow, cold poison that seeps into your bones. Have you ever been stabbed in the back by someone you would have taken a bullet for? It's a feeling you don't forget. The vote was unanimous. I had lost, completely and utterly. I stumbled out of the clubhouse into the damp, heavy air. The storm was closer now. I could smell the rain. As I walked across the parking lot, a big, shiny pickup truck pulled up and blocked my path. Steve rolled down the window. He wasn't smiling. You should have kept your mouth shut, old man, he snarled. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. He pointed a thick finger at me. This is your last warning. Drop it, or you'll regret it. He sped off, leaving a cloud of diesel fumes in his wake. I stood there, watching his taillights disappear, the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall. They felt like tiny cold stones against my skin. The rain came down hard that night, a relentless, punishing downpour. It matched the storm inside my head. I sat in my dark living room, the sounds of the meeting replaying in my mind, the raised hands, Dave's apologetic eyes, Brenda's triumphant voice. I was beaten. They had me cornered with their rules, their lawyers, and their lies. I walked to the back door and stared out at my workshop. The rain was hammering on its roof, streaming down the sides. It was more than just a building. It was my attempt at redemption, a monument to a past failure, and now they were going to tear it down. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Aisha. Did you see the weather alert? Flash flood watch in effect until 6 a.m. This is the big one. I looked at her message, then back at the workshop. A slow, cold anger began to replace the despair. It was the same feeling I'd had 20 years ago, standing on the edge of a collapsed bridge, knowing my calculations were wrong, the feeling of failure. But this time was different. This time, my calculations were right. I walked into my garage, flipping on the harsh fluorescent lights. The old brass pressure gauge, my symbol of failure, was sitting on my workbench. I picked it up. Its weight felt familiar, comforting. For years, it had reminded me of my mistake, but tonight, it reminded me of something else. I was an engineer. I understood pressure, I understood flow, and I understood that the best way to prove a theory isn't with paper. It's with a live demonstration. Brenda and Steve thought they were fighting me over a building. They were wrong. They were fighting a law of physics, and physics doesn't care about bylaws. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Aisha. Be careful. I was looking into that 2010 project. The contractor, Steve, put in a work order for an emergency inspection of the main drain for tomorrow morning. He's citing imminent failure risk. He's going to blame the storm on the old infrastructure and get a fat contract to fix it. And there it was, the whole scam laid bare. Steve and Brenda hadn't just diverted the water. They'd created a time bomb. They were waiting for a storm just like this one to cash in. Steve would be the hero, swooping in to fix the problem he secretly created, and Brenda would get her kickbacks. Everyone would be so grateful they'd forget all about my little workshop. It was a brilliant evil plan, but they made one mistake. They told me the playbook. I started making calls. First, I called the local news channel's tip line. I didn't give them my name. I just told them a major story was about to break at the Emergency Homeowners Association. Meeting Brenda had just called for the following evening. A story about corruption, flooding, and public safety. Then I called Aisha. I need a favor, I said. A big one. It's risky. I'm listening, she said, her voice steady. I need a drone and a few gallons of something bright, something you can't miss. There was a moment of silence. I knew I was asking her to cross a line, to risk her job. But then she said, I have some fluorescent dye tracer from a sewer line inspection, non-toxic, bright green. Where do you want it? A grim smile touched my lips. The main storm drain inlet, upstream from the old oak tree. and I need you to be ready to drop it on my signal. The final piece of the plan was the riskiest. I logged into the neighborhood's social media group. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For weeks they had used this platform to humiliate me. Now, it was my turn to use it. I started a new post. Emergency town hall tomorrow night at the school gym. Brenda and Steve will be presenting their plan to save our neighborhood from the flooding. I will also be there, and I will be presenting a live demonstration of my own. You won't want to miss it. I hit post. The message sat there for a moment, stark and defiant against the backdrop of angry comments and money bag emojis. Then the first like appeared, then another, then a comment. What demonstration? I didn't answer. I just shut the laptop. Let them wonder. Let them talk. The stage was set. The storm was here. And tomorrow night, I was going to make it rain. The school gym was buzzing with nervous energy. The air was humid and smelled of wet raincoats and fear. Outside, the rain was still coming down in sheets, a relentless drumming that served as the soundtrack for the evening. Half the neighborhood was there, drawn in by the storm and my cryptic promise of a demonstration. Brenda stood at a podium on the stage, looking severe and in charge. Steve was beside her, looking smug. Brenda began the meeting with a grave tone, talking about the unprecedented weather and the fragile state of our aging infrastructure. It was a masterful performance. She was setting the stage for Steve to be the hero. Then she turned her attention to me. Before we discuss the solution, she said, her eyes finding me in the crowd, we must address the cause. Years of neglect and recent, unapproved modifications, she glared at me, have put us all at risk. That was my cue. I walked to the side of the stage and picked up the microphone from the stand. You're right, Brenda, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous gym. The system is at risk, but not for the reasons you think. I nodded to the back of the room, where a large projection screen flickered to life. The image was a live feed from a drone, hovering high above our neighborhood in the pouring rain. It was grainy, but clear enough. Aisha, I said quietly into my phone, do it. On the screen, we saw a splash of brilliant, almost supernatural green erupt into the main storm drain inlet at the top of the street. That, ladies and gentlemen, I announced, is a non-toxic dye tracer. It will allow us to see exactly where our water is going. The crowd was mesmerized. On the screen, the green water surged down the main pipe, a glowing artery in the dark. It flowed for 100 yards, and then it stopped. It hit a solid, invisible wall. The green water churned, backed up, and then began spilling over the sides of the drain, sheeting across the street and lawns. What you're seeing, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence, is a concrete plug, installed 10 years ago by S&S Construction. I looked directly at Steve. His face had gone pale. The green tide on the screen was now flowing down the street, creeping into driveways. It was heading straight for a row of houses. A woman in the front row gasped, "That's my house!" And now, I said, turning back to the crowd, watch this. I pulled out my phone again and tapped an app I had designed myself. On the screen, a new image appeared from a camera mounted on my workshop. We saw the green water pooling against the back of the building. Then, with a low hum, the main intake valve on my workshop opened. The effect was instantaneous. A powerful vortex formed, and the green water began to pour into my collector. The floodwaters on the street receded almost as quickly as they had appeared. My luxury pool house was drinking the flood. The gym erupted. People were shouting, pointing at the screen, then at Brenda and Steve. The scam was laid bare for everyone to see. They hadn't just ignored a problem, they had engineered a disaster for profit. A man stood up and yelled, "They were going to let our houses flood." Brenda tried to speak, but her voice was drowned out. Steve just stood there, frozen, his face the color of wet cement. In the chaos, I saw a path forward, not for revenge, but for a real solution. I took the microphone again. "There's a choice here," I yelled, and the room slowly quieted down. "We can spend years in court, bankrupting our community and ourselves, or we can fix this, right now." I looked at Brenda. Her reign was over. "I propose a new, independent committee to oversee the immediate removal of that plug and a full audit of the drainage system. I will lead it, for free. All we ask is that the Homeowners Association immediately terminates its contract with S&S Construction and rewrites the bylaws that were used to attack me." It wasn't a question, it was a demand. The crowd roared its approval. It was over. Later, as the meeting broke up and people swarmed me with questions and apologies, I saw Dave standing by himself near the exit. He walked over, his face etched with shame. "Mark, I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I was a coward." I looked at him, the man who had been my friend. "I know, Dave," I said. It was all I could say. I walked out of the gym alone. The rain had finally stopped. The air was clean and cool. I had won. I had saved the neighborhood and cleared my name. But as I walked home, the distance between me and my old friend felt wider than any flood. I had paid a price for this victory, a quiet, personal one that no one else would ever see. Back in my workshop, I took the old brass pressure gauge from my pocket and placed it on a high shelf. Its job was done, and so was mine.